people are still confessing to the Black Dahlia murder in Hollywood. Anyway, with guilt, that kind of struck me specifically because guilt is a huge factor in Christianity. So I wanted to talk about that just for a moment. Anybody would be hard-pressed to try and claim that people who feel unworthy aren't drawn like flies to a religion that preaches redemption that one cannot access through one's own worth. A religion that specifically reinforces a reality that all humans are wretched would offer a great deal of appeal in the form of of relation and identity to someone with deep-seated self-esteem problems. Someone recently referred to this as I am the universe fallacy on the TV list. The idea was that however I feel, whatever I think, whatever I do, it's the same for everyone. It's not a rare perspective to exhibit. I gave an example where I show up at a dinner party, I've got a chocolate cake, I put it on the table and I say, who doesn't love chocolate cake? And the hostess says, I'm allergic. You assume everybody loves chocolate cake because you love chocolate cake and your friends love chocolate cake, so everybody loves chocolate cake. Not everybody loves chocolate cake. Not everyone can eat chocolate. So it reminds you that there are exceptions to these things that you think are ironclad rules. And, sometimes it takes getting hit upside the head with somebody who says that is the case. And in fact, one of the things that I talk about in this paper are the idea of, for example, if I didn't know it was true and someone said to me, nobody would live with somebody who beats them if they could leave.
Yeah.
I would say, of course. But I know that's not true. There are people who live with people who beat them and they can leave, but they are psychologically driven to stay. They are either afraid to leave. There's something about the situation that makes them stay in a situation that I can't conceive of staying in.
Yeah, the truth is, no rational person would stay in this situation provided they didn't have some other reason for staying in that situation.
Right, and yet we have these irrational people that, for example, they might not have children.
Or rational people who had a reason.
Yeah, like he'll hurt my children, I think, if I leave, or, I can't. So, whatever. I mean, the point is, you can't just simply say this is unreasonable. And so it would never happen, because the fact is people do things that by all external visual accounts are unreasonable. Mm-hmm. People are not reasonable sometimes when you try to judge reasonableness by a material benefit. Sometimes it doesn't pan out. People behave in ways that are contradictory and hypocritical. And that was one of the things I mentioned in here was the idea that the guilt motivation for a voluntary false confession is a way of punishing myself. It fits Christian martyrdom like a glove. If I think I'm a wretch who deserves hellfire and that I killed the uniquely good Messiah with my wickedness, then paying with my life while I witness to God would be the most glorious death imaginable. But would a Christian saint lie? Someone so devoted to God? Absolutely yes, if they were suffering from these issues. Good Christians have lied without gaining notoriety, redemption, or a rush. Every scribe that ever doctored a canon text to make it a little more orthodox is guilty of lying for the cause of Christianity. I'm sure they were aware it was dishonest, but a higher cause, a nobler goal was prompting them. The texts were revised. We have the notes in our Bibles today describing which passages have been added or altered from the older or better manuscripts. Quotes were fixed. Characters were made more consistent or gentler, but it was all to improve on the message for a greater good. So absolutely yes.
And you have Eusebius, one of the early church fathers, flatly stating that it's okay to lie if it serves the greater cause of, getting God's word out to people.
So I put, yes, people who subscribe vehemently to a doctrine will lie and die for it, even if the doctrine promotes honesty as a virtue. It's weirdly hypocritical and contradictory, but since when have religious zealots, or any of us for that matter, been immune as humans from hypocrisy or contradiction? Aren't these, ironically, some of the very flaws Christianity says we're all subject to? On that note, how ironic that an apologetic would be built around the idea that a human being couldn't possibly act in a way that makes no sense. We see it all the time. The Bible condemns us for it and calls it a sin and fault. I call it being human.
Yeah, they have attributed these martyrs with a character that they deny in everybody else.
Yeah, that they say doesn't exist, which is why you need salvation.
Yeah.
Would a reasonable person die for such a lie? No. But since when are humans, even most humans, reasonable? Where in the world was that fantasy bred? Other possible motives, according to, who do we have here? Richard Conti, Ph.D., Department of Psychology, College of St. Elizabeth, Morristown, New Jersey. In his paper, The Psychology of False Confessions, other possible motives for voluntary false confessions include an unconscious need to expiate guilt over previous transgressions through self-punishment. I can't pronounce it. It's some kind of Nordic researcher's name.
Johnson.
Thank you. Johnson points out that a previous transgression can be either a real or imagined act. He further states transgression does not necessarily have to be identifiable. Some individuals have a high level of generalized guilt which is not related to a specific transgression, and this may influence a range of their behaviors, including their need to volunteer a false confession. I'm not going to get into this next part too much, but I do want to point out that according to Craig Bunnell, in his paper Voluntary False Confessions and Overview, he points out that guilt is linked to depression, which is a well-known psychological problem that impacts loads of people. I don't know that there's anybody that doesn't have a friend or a family member or knows someone who's depressed or has depression. And I'm going to pull some quick quotes out from him. I'm not going to read the whole thing because I've got quite a substantial amount pulled from there. But it says, one of the things he says that's relevant is, in the case of falsely confessing to a crime they did not commit, this punishment comes via fines, prison sentences, even death. He also says the individual has a pathological need to become infamous, even if it means having to face the prospect of punishment. And he says, he's the one that said, quoted Johnson saying, perhaps even confessing to crimes that do not exist. And then in the end, he says, this is not to say that research hasn't identified observable behavioral differences between truth-tellers and deceivers, only that the ability of people to recognize these differences is not very impressive. And this led me into something else, which was the idea that I can recognize when someone's telling the truth.
And I don't know if this dovetails into it, but talking more about the martyrs real quick, there is a presumption that we know the minds and thoughts of the people who died, so we know why they actually died. It may be the case, and this is purely hypothetical and it's drawing from several different aspects, that here is an individual who, let's say, knows that what he's been preaching is not accurate, but believes that it is in everyone's best interest that they believe it. Believes that it is important for people to accept this, even though it's not true, because he has a strong belief that not accepting this would be worse than accepting it. And therefore, this person may willingly go to their death, refusing to denounce something that they know to be untrue, because they think there's a greater good in people believing this, despite the fact that it's not true, or in cases where they may be doubtful, they believe that there's a greater benefit in people accepting this, even if it may not be true. You don't even have to work very hard to find examples why somebody might willingly die, not for a lie, but professing a lie. They're dying for they're always dying. In this case, in this martyr example that I'm using, they're dying for something they think is true. It's just that you don't know what that is. They're dying. I'm not all right. The examples.
No,
they're dying for a belief that is not the belief that you think that they're dying for.
Yeah, and I just want to add that not a month goes by that we don't get at least one, if not more, people writing to us to say, I agree with you, religion isn't true, but, I mean, isn't it good? Isn't it a good thing? Isn't it helpful? So there is this, idea that even if it's a lie, it's still helping people, so maybe you should just let it, it's helpful to people. So what Matt is kind of saying is, suppose you had somebody that was like strongly of the opinion that this is, not just helpful to people, but necessary for people, to do something like be good, be moral people. Then, there's a possibility that person would say, this has to be demonstrated.
That in conjunction with the public investment.
Right.
I mean, I can tell you right now, I have no interest in being a martyr. Right. Some nut job gets me and puts a gun at my head and says, tell me you believe in Jesus or I'm going to blow your head off.
Oh, yeah.
Jesus, he's my buddy.
Yep.
And it's because this is a situation where it doesn't really matter. It's the best course of action is for me to do whatever it takes to prevent me from dying. There may be other situations where martyrdom, the same scenario with an addition, where martyrdom actually becomes viable. where somebody, now you're in public on TV at the Super Bowl, and you're in the same situation. What do you do? The more publicly invested you are in something, the more likely you are to defend it, whether it's true or not, whether you are justified in that belief or not. And you'd have to say that would be the case for somebody who's been publicly preaching something, all over the place.
But what's funny is, even in a highly public situation, if you had a gun to your head, I mean, to me, I wouldn't even need to think twice. You know what I mean? Because who would think that you were telling the truth if someone had to put a gun to your head to make you say it?
Yeah.
Obviously, you're lying. No, so, I mean, there wouldn't even be, to me, in my mind, the prospect that someone would say, "Oh, but you said it."
Yeah.
It's like, what kind of an idiot is going to think that because I said it with a gun to my head that it must therefore be true?
Yeah. It's a reason why we don't take confessions that are made at gunpoint.
That's why we shouldn't torture, maybe.
If I'm there at the Super Bowl, if this is your master plan to kidnap me and take me to the Super Bowl halftime show, put a gun to my head and get me to say I love Jesus, I'm going to say I love Jesus, and then I'm going to fuck with your head until we are the best friends, and then I'm going to knock you the hell out and make sure that you're arrested, and I'll say, whew, yep, I lied. Because you know what? Lying isn't always the wrong thing.
Well, yeah, and the point is, too, the weird thing to me is that as a Christian, you're expected to be imperfect, and so if you did tell a lie, the whole point to the religion is that you can be forgiven for it. You might lie and feel really bad about it. I'm sorry, but someone had a gun to my head. I didn't want to lie, but, God, I got scared and I lied. And so, Jesus, please forgive me, and then you're forgiven, and guess what? You get the same reward whether you're martyred or not, so what is the point? And let's see, but then I go on the CBS News story, that one that we mentioned earlier. Hirsch says in that the rule of thumb is that everybody does overreact to a confession. There tends to be an assumption that it's true. And there were some disturbing things that I found when I was looking in the research for this. And one of the things that was really disturbing was that when you ask people, would they be influenced by a confession that they knew was coerced, or was potentially coerced, that there was good reason to believe was coerced, they said, no, I would discount that. But when you do mock trials and you present evidence, and then you add to that evidence a coerced confession that you tell them was probably coerced, they find the person guilty more often. People say, I would know that if it was coerced, I shouldn't use it, and yet the juries seem to be influenced by even a coerced confession. That's how hard a confession hits our brain.
Yeah.
We believe it, even if we have reason to think it's false. The other thing was, if a person confessed, all right, let's say I confessed and there was no evidence of coercion, but someone presents evidence to show that my confession is false. Like I say I killed somebody and someone says, no, here's pictures of you at a nightclub at the time of the death. Okay, so I'm confessing to this. I'm not claiming it was coerced, but you're presenting evidence that shows I've got to be lying. Juries will believe my confession. It's crazy. People believe confessions. If someone confesses to a thing, people are prone to believe it, and it's hard to accept that about humanity, but it seems to be demonstrable.
And it's another example of how we rely on inference and induction, because most of the time it's useful. Most of the time it's correct. Most of the time today is pretty much going to be like yesterday. Most of the time, if somebody's confessing, they're probably telling the truth.
Right.
I mean, there are specific examples, but the grand statement that this is always the case, nobody would knowingly die for a lie. Why, yes, actually they would.
And the other issue that came up that was really disturbing was that there's a negative correlation between how well you think you can tell between a true and false confession versus how well you actually can.
Wow.